ways to look at the overhead variances. The book discusses the multiple ways, depending on if you recognize overhead in total versus do you break it out between its variable and fixed components. Since breaking it out in its variable and fixed components actually provides the most information, that's what we're going to look at in here. And those are the ones that need to be responsible. Now, with these variances, what's going on here, remember, I said that this is standard costing. Well, the difference between standard costing and normal costing when it comes to overhead is, well, remember, we apply overhead. In both cases, we're going to apply overhead. Normal costing, we have that predetermined rate and multiplied it by the actual cost driver amount, be it actual direct labor hours, actual machine hours, whatever we could actually measure. So we had our predetermined rate and then multiplied by the actual cost driver amount. In standard costing, we're going to take that predetermined overhead rate and multiply it by that standard cost driver amount. The standard amount of direct labor hours we should have used in production, or the amount of machine hours we should have used in production. So that's going to be the difference here. Is instead of using the actual machine hours that we use to make our 19,000 batches of cookies, when we apply overhead, it's actually going to be based on the amount of machine hours we should have used to make 19,000 batches of cookies. So that's going to be the difference there. I'm not actually having you apply overhead per se in the accounts using this, but that's necessary to understand when we're going to start looking at these variances. Okay? All right. So what's going to happen? Well, the variable overhead variances. They're going to look similar to our direct labor variances and our direct materials variance. How we're looking at this. We have our, instead of the price variance, we have a spending variance. And instead of a quantity variance, we actually call it an efficiency variance. Yeah. Are going to be the actual variable overhead, the actual cost of variable overhead, and then our standard variable overhead, which is actually in standard costing is the amount of overhead that you apply. And then we have our middle column, called the variance column. Here we'll get our spending variance. And here we'll get our efficiency variance. Actual variable overhead, the difference, in direct material and direct labor, we figured out how much we paid for the package of chocolate chip cookies and multiplied by how many chocolate chip, or package of chocolate chips, and multiplied by how many bags of chocolate chips that we actually used. Actual variable overhead, that's just going to give you a total amount. much your variable overhead is going to actually come into how many machine hours, how many direct labor hours you use, whatever you're using as the cost driver. There's this relationship we think exists so we can apply it, but really there's no two numbers to multiply together to get actual variable overhead. We just simply know what it is. You know how much you spend on all your variable overhead pieces. Now, yes, you may have to go and do some calculations to separate the variable overhead from the fixed overhead, but it's in a total number. So actual variable overhead for Mikey's Tasty Treats, it came in at $14,250. Actual variable overhead. So when we had our key accounts, manufacturing overhead, the actual amount, well, the variable component was $14,250. It's just given. Just our actual cost. Well, what would have been then on this side based on standard costing? That would be our applied overhead. Well, we would have had to have some sort of predetermined overhead rate. So we know how to calculate predetermined overhead rate if we had the estimated variable overhead and then the estimated cost driver. In our case, the cost driver is direct labor hours. So we know that. We've done that before. So our rate comes in, predetermined overhead rate done for us, $2.40. Based on within our estimated variable overhead divided by our estimated direct labor hours. Okay. Something we've done before. Nothing new there. I'm just telling you that's 240 because I don't have the estimated overhead amount. So for every 1 hour of direct labor, we're going to apply $2.40. The thing in standard costing is it's how many direct labor hours we should have used. Our standard is how standard costing we apply based on the standard. Well, we already know all that stuff about direct labor hours because on our standard cost card, originally told us that it should be labor hours. 0.25 labor hours per batch of cookies. We actually made 19,000 batches of cookies. So we expected to use 4,750 hours. Okay. So instead of using actual direct labor hours, when we go to apply overhead, standard costing is going to use how many hours we should have used, which is the 4,750 times our predetermined rate of $2.40.
$11,400.
There was a 6 somewhere. I just can't remember what it was. Okay. So that would be how much we would have applied. Now, with the standard costing, yes, we have the over-under applied. Part of it's going to be related to our variances here. So we want to know our spending variance. Spending variance is simply related to what we actually spent on overhead and what, based on actual direct labor hours, we would have expected to spend on overhead. So here is going to be the actual hours, or whatever the actual cost driver, times the predetermined. Which is actually, actual quantity times standard price, if you want to look at it in that version. So we know back from the direct labor that we actually had 5,700 hours that we used in production. So our actual cost driver, direct labor hours, 5,700. We expected to apply our direct labor hours is causing our variable overhead. We would expect to follow in that pattern as the direct labor hours. We can match up at 5,700 hours how much our cost should have been. Variable cost, 13,680. So, actual variable overhead, 14,250. Overhead based on producing 19,000 batches of cookies, what we would have expected to use for direct labor hours. Overhead, variable overhead should have came in 11,400. That's what we applied, 11,400. Now, based on 5,700 actual direct labor hours, overhead should have came in at 13,680. So this is our spending variance. What overhead actually came in at versus the nature of a variable cost that we're saying is based on direct labor hours, what it should have came in at. There. Actual cost came in higher than we expected them to. Unfavorable. Now, it's called a spending variance rather than a price variance because actually two things could have caused this. It could have been, yes, we had higher prices on our variable cost. Maybe kilowatt hours went up. Just some prices. As the price of natural gas goes up, usually you pay higher per kilowatt hour on your electricity. So that could be a price variance. It could also be that we're consuming larger quantities than expected. That it's taking actually more kilowatt hours to produce our cookies than we had used before. So maybe we're running the air conditioner a little bit more. We're running the heat a little bit more. Whatever it comes in at. So we might be using our electricity a little bit more than we expected to. So there can be two things involved in here. So what we call
a spending variance rather than just a pure price variance. So it's more than just the price per the variable cost that we're looking at. It's also using those variable cost items. So what we got going on here is it also could be a relationship between our cost driver and, what we're saying is the cost per unit. That might not be a good cost driver, it could also be causing the spending variance. Now, efficiency variance. The difference in what we actually applied versus how much, I guess we should have applied based on actual hours. That difference comes in, let's get this number right, 2,080. We call it efficiency variance, but it's not really telling us anything about use of the variable cost. It's telling us what we already know since we've already done a direct labor variance. How well we use direct labor. This one, direct labor is our cost driver. It's not telling us anything new. We already knew we had an unfavorable direct labor variance. So we already knew we weren't efficiently using our direct labor. We weren't using it in the manner that we expected to. We already knew that. Now, you could get some benefit if our cost driver was machine hours, and you could see how well efficiently we were using our machine hours. Or were we using the number of machine hours we expected for 19,000 batches of cookies versus what we actually used in machine hours. That's what the efficiency variable overhead variance tells us. How well we used the cost driver rather than how well we used the actual variable cost. So what we learned from the variable overhead variances. That we have some sort of small, 570, problem with either the price we paid on our variable cost or actually, how much of our variable cost we use, something going on there. And then, in this case, something we already knew, that we didn't use direct labor hours in the manner we thought we would. That's what we get from the variable overhead variances. Okay? Questions? Yes?
The 5,700 direct labor hours of the variance column, was that a PUD number?
That was, we got that from our direct labor variances when we calculated those. The actual labor came in at 5,700 hours, or it was an average of 0.3 hours per batch of cookies. So that came from that other page, yeah. You have a question? Yeah.
I guess I'm just not understanding when you know it's favorable and when it's unfavorable.
Okay, what you're looking at is the actual cost versus what you expected. So in this case, actual is a lot clearer what actual is. You got actual written on this side versus what you're comparing it with. When you come over here, this column becomes your actual because you're looking at the actual direct labor hours you used versus how many you should have used. So whenever your actual costs are higher than they should have been, that's unfavorable. Whenever your actual costs were less than what you expected them to be, then that's favorable. So you kind of got to think in terms of that initial reaction to seeing your costs. Seeing your costs higher than you thought they'd be, you're kind of upset. So that's unfavorable. That's how you determine unfavorable, favorable. Other questions? All right. So controllability starts to get a little less with the overhead variances. Yes, probably can do something about maybe how you're using electricity, if it has to do with what you're setting the thermostat at. Yeah, you could change it so the air conditioner doesn't kick on quite as much. So that's a little bit you can control. But if the electric company raises your rates, they just raised your rates. You can try to call and complain, but that really doesn't get you anywhere. So there's that issue. Over here, well, yeah, we already knew since we we were using direct labor hours that we had a problem. We've already been dealing with it. So it's not anything new. Because machine hours, we may, we had an unfavorable variance. Maybe it has something to do with our machines. Maybe there's a problem. Are they not running as efficiently as we thought they were? Yes, it has a little bit more controllability, and we can go in and check out why our machines aren't producing in the manner that we thought. But again, it's getting to be a little less controllability than we had specifically with direct materials and direct labor. Okay. Let's talk about the fixed overhead variances. With our fixed overhead, we'll have a spending variance and a volume variance. Fixed overhead should be fixed no matter what the quantity is. It's fixed in nature. So the idea is that, no matter what our output is, it's going to stay constant. So when we're talking about spending variance, we'll have our actual overhead, or actual fixed overhead. Again, there's no multiplying two numbers together to get actual fixed overhead. It's what you spent on rent. It's what you spent on insurance. Those actual checks you wrote, that's total cost. Actual fixed overhead for Mike and Tasty Treats this year, $10,000. We just know what actual fixed overhead was. Actual fixed overhead, well, what do we compare that with to see if we spent too much on it? Well, since this should be fixed no matter what the quantity is, we're actually going to compare that to budgeted fixed overhead. So that's the only number we have to compare with, did we spend too much on it? Because budgeted fixed overhead should be the same no matter what the quantity is. So it doesn't matter if we budgeted to make 18,000 batches of cookies versus actual batches being 19,000. It's fixed. It doesn't care. So budgeted fixed overhead, we're told that we go back to find the budget and all that stuff. It came in at $9,600. That means, do that. We have a difference here of $400. Cost actually came in higher than we budgeted, or what we expected. All this tells us is that fixed overhead costs are higher. Did rent go up? Did our insurance premiums go up? We go and we will look at individual fixed overhead pieces to see what went up. Did we have to spend money on something we weren't expecting? That's what we get out of this information. So the only thing we really can do with this is to look at the individual pieces and help with budgeting next period. That's what we get out of this. Yes, there's some controllability there. If suddenly we're having our insurance premiums go up, well, maybe we should shop around to see if we can get a better deal. That's what we get out of this variance. other variance, the volume variance, is based on, again, how we apply the fixed overhead. Because again, remember, we apply it so that we don't know when actuals come in and that sort of thing. And fixed overhead is one of those reasons that we apply overhead. Because we'll get the insurance premium in the middle of the year that we have to pay. Or we may pay rent all up front. The fixed costs come in at different parts of the year, even though maybe our production happens throughout. So we don't need our costs of production to fluctuate month in and month out just because then we have to pay a fixed cost. So we apply the overhead. Something we've done before. So would we have applied overhead? Well, let's say we, there's the trophies in there. We're going to apply overhead based on batches of cookies. It's going to be a straight volume-based overhead application. So we have our budgeted fixed overhead, and we have our budgeted batches of cookies. To get our predetermined overhead rate. Budgeted fixed overhead. $9,600. Our budgeted batches of cookies, well, I'm telling you how long it's $18,000. Production fluctuates and how the fixed overhead costs come in, we can apply 53 cents of fixed overhead per batch of cookies so that we can have our applied and we can have, eventually as the actuals come in, we can put them here. Alright, so how much overhead would we have applied during this year based on batches of cookies? Actual batches of cookies was 19,000 at 53 cents each. We would have applied 10,070. So over here, compare our budgeted number. Remember back when I said when we were talking about overhead and how these differences would be under or overapplied, and someone said, well, what do we do with that budgeted number? And I said, when we get to variances, we'll talk about it in a little bit. Well, here's where we're actually going to compare budgeted fixed overhead with applied fixed overhead. We applied 10,070. We know this difference here, that $70 is over-applied overhead, and we'll deal with that accordingly, how we deal with that. This difference is our volume variance. It's $470. Technically, with the volume variance, we don't categorize it as favorable or unfavorable. Technically, yes, actual was less than what we applied, but really what does that mean, calling that unfavorable? Okay, so we budgeted, and then that's considered our actual. That doesn't really tell us anything. All that's happening here is when the plan and the standard differ. All this variance is telling us is we produced more batches than we expected. This is actually a capacity variance. How well we used our capacity. Our budgeted fixed overhead, when we came about figuring out 9,600, our capacity that we used was the 18,000 batches of cookies. We said we were going to make 18,000 batches of cookies. We did all our planning based on 18,000 batches of cookies. Well, what actually happened? Well, we used 19,000 batches of cookies. So if we were trying to apply the overhead based on planned production, and then we actually apply it on actual production, yes, we're going to have this difference. Because we used a higher capacity than we expected to. Reasons for this? Well, maybe demand went up. So we made more batches of cookies. For the most part, the overhead variance, at least the fixed overhead variances, are considered uncontrollable. This one specifically is called the uncontrollable variance. It's because there's factors outside the company, we're assuming, that cause you to produce more batches of cookies. Or if it was the other way around, cause you to produce less batches of cookies. You didn't want to have more batches of cookies than you can sell. Well, this is customer driven. That's your capacity. So that's the volume variance. It's simply based on what you applied versus what you planned for. Okay? The difference between what you planned and actual, well, that's your spending variance. Fixed cost went up. You need to figure out why. What particular one of the fixed costs were higher. And that's going to depend on how well you planned. Did you individual line item stuff or not?